The sleek silver ship appeared without warning above Luna Station, its hull gleaming like polished metal in the harsh sunlight of space. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the observation deck, watching the alien vessel through reinforced glass as it slowly approached the human outpost. The ship was beautiful in a way that human vessels could never be. All flowing curves and gentle lines that suggested a people who had never known the harsh realities of war. Jake adjusted his uniform and checked his sidearm one more time before heading to the docking bay. Earth Defense Force protocols were clear about first contact situations, but nobody had really expected it to happen in his lifetime. The diplomats were still rushing up from Earth, but someone had to greet these visitors, and Jake was the ranking officer on the station. The airlock cycled with a soft hiss, and Jake got his first look at an alien being. Ambassador Zethkar of the Villani was tall and graceful, with pale blue skin and large eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. Behind him came a small delegation of various species, all wearing similar flowing robes that looked more like academic gowns than military uniforms. "Greetings, Captain Morrison," Zethkar said in perfect English, his voice carrying a musical quality that made Jake think of wind chimes. "I am honored to make first contact with your species on behalf of the Galactic Federation. We come in peace and friendship, hoping to welcome humanity into our community of civilized worlds." Jake shook the offered hand, noting how soft it felt, like someone who had never done manual labor. "Welcome to Luna Station, Ambassador. We're honored by your visit." The tour of the station went smoothly enough. Zethkar and his delegation seemed impressed by human technology, though they politely declined to share details about their own capabilities. They spoke of the Federation as a vast alliance of species that had long ago abandoned the primitive ways of conflict and violence. For over 2 centuries, they explained, the galaxy had known peace. "We have learned that true strength comes not from weapons, but from understanding," Zethkar said as they walked through the station's small hydroponics bay. "When disputes arise between member worlds, we resolve them through mediation, economic incentives, and careful negotiation. Violence is considered a relic of less enlightened times." Jake nodded politely, though something about the alien's words bothered him. It sounded nice in theory, but human history had taught him that there were always those who preferred to take what they wanted rather than ask for it. Still, he kept his thoughts to himself as the tour continued. The real conversation began in the station's conference room, where Zethkar spread out holographic displays showing the scope of Federation space. Hundreds of star systems, thousands of worlds, all living in harmony under the guidance of the Federation Council. It was an impressive sight, and Jake could understand why they were confident in their peaceful approach. "We would be honored to sponsor humanity's application for Federation membership," Zethkar said, his large eyes focusing intently on Jake. "Your species shows great promise, and we believe you could contribute much to our alliance. However, there is one particular area where we feel your expertise could be invaluable." Jake leaned forward, curious. "What area is that, Ambassador?" "Military training," Zethkar replied, and Jake blinked in surprise. "You see, Captain, while we have long lived in peace, we maintain ceremonial military forces for traditional purposes and disaster relief operations. However, our recent encounters with certain aggressive entities at the rim of our space have suggested that perhaps our approach to military preparedness could benefit from fresh perspectives." Jake tried to hide his confusion. "I'm not sure I understand, Ambassador. If you've been at peace for 2 centuries, what kind of military training are you looking for?" Zethkar's expression became slightly embarrassed. "To be honest, Captain, our military forces are more symbolic than functional. Our officers study theoretical tactics and engage in what you might call elaborate parade drills. We have simulation systems for training, but they are designed to be completely safe and non-threatening. No one has actually fired a weapon in combat for generations." "And you want humans to help change that?" Jake asked, beginning to understand the situation. "We hope that your species might provide instructors to help modernize our approach to strategic thinking," Zethkar explained. "We assume that humanity, like all civilized species, has moved beyond primitive warfare into more sophisticated forms of conflict resolution. Perhaps your people could teach our officers about advanced negotiation tactics, economic warfare strategies, or improved simulation technologies." Jake almost laughed at the aliens' assumptions about human civilization, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. The Federation clearly had no idea what they were asking for. Humans hadn't moved beyond warfare. They had perfected it to an art form that would probably terrify these peaceful aliens. "I would need to discuss this with my superiors on Earth," Jake said carefully. "This kind of decision is well above my authority level." "Of course, Zefkar." "Agreed. We would not expect an immediate answer to such an important request. Perhaps you could arrange for us to speak with your military leadership? We are prepared to offer significant compensation for the right instructor, including advanced Federation technologies and favorable trade agreements." The meeting concluded with exchanged communication protocols and promises of further discussion. As Jake watched the alien ship depart, he wondered what Earth's government would make of this opportunity. The Federation was clearly powerful and advanced, but their complete ignorance about human military capabilities was both amusing and slightly concerning. Within hours of the alien departure, Jake found himself on a priority communication link with General Lisa Hayes at Earth Defense Command. The general listened to his report with growing interest, occasionally asking pointed questions about Federation military capabilities and force structures. "So they want a military trainer," General Hayes said when Jake finished his briefing. "And they think we're going to send them someone to teach negotiation tactics and parade ground maneuvers." "That seems to be their expectation, General," Jake confirmed. "They have no concept of actual warfare as we understand it." General Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could almost see the wheels turning in her mind. The Federation represented incredible opportunities for humanity, but they were also revealing a dangerous naivety about the realities of galactic politics. If there really were aggressive entities at the rim of Federation space, these peaceful aliens might be in for a very rude awakening. "I'm going to recommend that we accept their offer," General Hayes finally said. "But we're going to send them exactly what they asked for, even if they don't realize what that means. I have someone in mind who might be perfect for this assignment." Jake had a feeling that the galaxy was about to get a very educational introduction to human military doctrine, whether the Federation was ready for it or not. Staff Sergeant Danny Rodriguez stepped off the Federation transport ship onto the crystal platform of Kepler Prime and immediately knew he was not in Kansas anymore. The military training facility stretched out before him like something from a science fiction movie, all gleaming spires and floating walkways that defied everything he knew about practical architecture. Everything was too clean, too perfect, too much like a museum display, rather than a place where real soldiers learned to fight. The welcoming committee consisted of 3 aliens in elaborate ceremonial uniforms that looked like they belonged on a parade float rather than a battlefield. The leader, a tall insectoid creature with 4 arms, stepped forward with movements so precise they seemed choreographed. "Welcome, Instructor Rodriguez," the alien said in accented English. "I am Training Coordinator Vashtel. We are most eager to learn from your expertise in strategic conflict resolution and theoretical combat applications." Danny nodded politely while mentally translating what he had just heard. These people had no idea what they had asked for. General Hayes had briefed him thoroughly on the Federation's expectations, but seeing their training facility in person made it clear just how wide the gap was between human and alien concepts of military preparation. "Thank you for having me," Danny replied. "When do I meet the trainees?" "Immediately, if you wish," Vashtel said, leading him toward a massive dome structure. "We have assembled 200 of our finest young officers from 12 different species. They are all highly educated in military theory and have completed advanced simulation training." The dome interior was even more impressive than the exterior, with holographic displays showing star maps and theoretical battle formations. Rows of comfortable chairs faced a central platform, and Danny could see various alien species scattered throughout the seating area. They all looked eager and attentive, Like university students waiting for a lecture. Danny walked onto the platform and looked out at the assembled cadets. They ranged from humanoid to completely alien, but they all shared the same quality he had noticed in Vashtel. They looked soft, like people who had never experienced real hardship or danger. "Good morning," Danny said, his voice carrying easily through the dome's acoustics. "I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and I'm here to teach you about military operations. Before we begin, I'd like to know about your experience. How many of you have fired a weapon in combat?" Silence greeted his question. The cadets looked confused, as if he had asked them something in a foreign language. A blue-skinned humanoid in the front row raised his hand tentatively. "Instructor Rodriguez, do you mean in simulation? We have all completed thousands of hours of combat simulation training." "No," Danny said patiently. "I mean real weapons fired at real targets in actual combat situations where people were trying to kill you." The confusion deepened. A reptilian cadet near the back spoke up. "Instructor, we do not understand the question. No civilized being has engaged in actual combat for over 2 centuries. Such activities are considered barbaric and unnecessary." Danny felt a chill run down his spine as the reality of the situation hit him. These weren't soldiers, not in any sense he understood. They were academics playing dress-up, going through the motions of military training without any comprehension of what warfare actually meant. "I see," Danny said slowly. "Well, we're going to change that. Everyone outside, for physical conditioning." The next hour was an education for both Danny and the cadets. What the Federation called physical training was a joke by human military standards. The aliens went through gentle stretching exercises and light jogging that wouldn't challenge a human child. When Danny demonstrated proper push-ups, sit-ups, and running pace, half the cadets couldn't keep up and the other half complained about the excessive demands. Things got worse when Danny introduced them to actual weapons. The Federation training weapons were sophisticated simulation devices that produced light shows and recorded hits without any physical impact. Danny had brought real human military equipment, including M4 rifles loaded with blank ammunition for training purposes. The first time Danny fired a blank round, 3 cadets fainted from the noise and several others ran from the training area. The smell of gunpowder and the sharp crack of the rifle firing seemed to trigger some kind of primal fear response in beings who had never experienced anything more dangerous than a stubbed toe. "This is madness," declared Cadet Zefter, a tall humanoid with gray skin and large eyes. "Why would anyone subject themselves to such trauma? Our simulation systems provide all the training benefits without the psychological damage." Danny looked at the cadet with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Because simulation doesn't prepare you for the real thing. When someone is actually shooting at you, your pretty computer games won't save your life." "But no one shoots at anyone anymore," Zefter protested. "Violence is a thing of the past. We resolve conflicts through negotiation and economic pressure." "Tell that to these aggressive entities your people mentioned," Danny replied. "The ones causing problems at the rim of Federation space. Do you think they're going to stop attacking because you ask them nicely?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Danny could see that some of the cadets were beginning to think, to question their assumptions about how the universe worked. But others looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the training was taking. By the end of the first week, formal complaints had been filed with the Federation Council. Danny found himself called to a meeting with Training Coordinator Vashtel and several other high-ranking officials. They sat around a crystal table in a room that looked more like a luxury hotel than a military command center. "Instructor Rodriguez," Vashtel began carefully, "we have received numerous reports about your training methods. Many of our cadets are describing them as unnecessarily harsh and potentially harmful." "Harmful how?" Danny asked. "Nobody's been injured. We're using blanks and safety equipment." "The psychological impact," another official interjected. "Exposing young minds to such aggressive stimuli could cause lasting trauma. Several cadets have requested transfer to different programs." Danny leaned back in his chair and looked around the table at these beings who thought they could maintain galactic peace through wishful thinking. Let me ask you something. When these Rim Raiders attack your colonies, do you think they're going to care about your psychological well-being? The Rim situation is being handled through diplomatic channels, Vashtel said stiffly. Violence is not the answer to every problem. Maybe not, Danny agreed. But when violence is the problem, only violence is the answer. And if you want your people to survive when diplomacy fails, they need to know how to fight. The meeting ended with Danny being told to moderate his training methods and focus more on theoretical applications. He agreed publicly while privately, planning to do exactly the opposite. These people needed to wake up to reality, and he was going to make sure they did, whether they liked it or not. The summons came on a Tuesday morning while Danny was teaching his cadets how to properly dig fighting positions. The message was delivered by a nervous-looking Federation courier who seemed disturbed by the sight of aliens, covered in dirt and sweat, working with actual shovels instead of fancy machinery. "Instructor Rodriguez," the courier said, careful not to step too close to the training area. "The Federation Council requests your immediate presence for a demonstration of training effectiveness. You have 6 weeks to prepare a unit for evaluation." Against the Honor Guard. Danny looked up from where he was showing Cadet Vextai how to camouflage a foxhole with local vegetation. The Krillian warrior caste alien was one of the few cadets who had embraced the human training methods, though. Even he struggled with concepts that seemed obvious to Danny. "What kind of evaluation?" Danny asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A large-scale war game," the courier replied. "Your trained unit against the Federation's elite honor guard. The Council wishes to determine whether your methods produce results superior to traditional Federation military training." After the courier left, Danny gathered his core group of cadets who had stuck with the program despite the complaints and transfers. Out of the original 200, only 43 remained. The others had either quit in frustration or been pulled out by concerned families who thought Danny was corrupting their children with primitive human barbarism. "They want to test us," Danny announced to the group. 6 weeks from now, we go up against their best troops in a war game. Anyone who wants out can leave now with no hard feelings." Not a single cadet moved. Vextai stepped forward, his scaled face showing the first real smile Danny had seen from any of them since arriving. "Instructor Rodriguez," the Krillian said, in his careful English, "we have learned much from you about the reality of combat. We wish to prove that these lessons have value. The Honor Guard trains in the old ways with ceremony and tradition but no understanding of actual warfare. We will show them what it means to fight." The next 6 weeks were the most intensive training period of Danny's military career. He pushed his mixed species unit through every scenario he could think of, drawing on his experiences in urban warfare, jungle fighting, desert operations, and close-quarters combat. The Federation had given him access to a contested moon with varied terrain for training purposes, probably thinking he would use it for gentle exercises. Instead, Danny turned it into a replica of every hellhole he had ever fought in. His cadets learned to move silently through dense forest, to use natural caves for ambush points, to coordinate attacks across multiple terrain types, and to think like predators rather than prey. More importantly, they learned that winning sometimes meant accepting casualties and making hard choices. Captain Ben Parker arrived during the 4th week of training, sent by Earth Defense Command to assist with specialized instruction. The Navy SEAL brought with him a wealth of knowledge about reconnaissance, sabotage, and psychological warfare that complemented Danny's more direct approach to combat training. "These kids are learning fast," Ben observed after watching the cadets execute a night raid on a mock enemy position, but they still think too much like civilians. They hesitate when they should act, and they try to save everyone when sometimes you have to sacrifice a few to save the many. "It's their upbringing," Danny replied. 2 centuries of peace makes it hard to accept that sometimes violence is the only solution, but they're getting there. The breakthrough came during a simulated hostage rescue scenario. The cadets had been struggling with the concept that acceptable losses were sometimes necessary to complete a mission. When faced with a situation where saving all the hostages would result in the entire team being captured, They repeatedly chose failure over hard choices. Danny stopped the exercise and gathered the group around him on the rocky hillside overlooking the training facility. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of combat experience. "In the real world, there are no perfect solutions. Sometimes good people die, no matter what you do. Your job as soldiers is not to save everyone. Your job is to complete the mission so that more good people don't die later." Vextai raised his hand. "But instructor, how do we choose who lives? And who dies? How do we make such terrible decisions?" "You make them fast, based on the best information you have, and then you live with the consequences," Danny answered. "Because if you don't make them, someone else will make them for you, and they probably won't care about saving anyone." The war game began exactly 6 weeks after the original challenge. The honor guard arrived in a formation that looked more like a parade than a military operation. Their uniforms were spotless, their equipment gleamed in the sunlight, and their movements were precise and choreographed. They set up their base camp with textbook efficiency, following procedures that had been refined over decades of ceremonial service. Danny watched from his hidden command post as the honor guard deployed. According to standard Federation doctrine, their commander, General Kethmore, established a central headquarters with clear communication lines and supply routes. Everything was organized, logical, and completely predictable. "They're doing exactly what their manual tells them to do," Ben observed through his binoculars. "No improvisation, no adaptation to local conditions. It's like they're fighting the last war they never had." Danny's unit had spent the previous night infiltrating the game area using techniques the honor guard had never encountered. While the Federation forces were setting up their pretty base camp, his cadets were already in position to strike at supply lines, communication centers, and isolated outposts. The first attack came at dawn. 3 honor guard communication posts went silent simultaneously as Danny's teams used stealth and coordination to eliminate them without raising alarms. By the time the Federation forces realized they were under attack, they had lost their ability to coordinate a response. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic dismantling of everything the honor guard thought they knew about warfare. Danny's cadets struck from unexpected directions, used the terrain to their advantage, created diversions to mask their real objectives, and coordinated attacks across multiple fronts. The honor guard tried to respond with traditional tactics, forming up in defensive positions and waiting for direct assault. Instead, they found their supply convoys ambushed, their officers eliminated by sniper fire, and their communications jammed by teams they never saw coming. 18 hours after the exercise began, General Kethmore surrendered unconditionally. His forces had been routed so completely that many of his officers were found wandering the battlefield in confusion. Unable to understand what had happened to their carefully planned defense, the Federation observers who had come to evaluate Danny's training methods watched the recordings in stunned silence. They had expected a demonstration of improved tactics, not a complete revolution in how warfare could be conducted. Danny stood before the Federation Council that evening, still wearing his combat gear and carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. The aliens looked at him with expressions he had learned to recognize over the past few months, fear mixed with grudging respect. "Your methods are effective," General Kethmore admitted, his voice hollow with defeat. "But at what cost? You have taught these young beings to think like predators, to accept violence as a solution, to make choices that no civilized person should have to make." "I've taught them to survive," Danny replied simply. "And if those rim raiders you're so worried about are half as dangerous as you claim, survival might be the only victory you can hope for." Senior Analyst Kethmore sat in his darkened office staring at the holographic display floating above his desk. The data streaming across the screen would have been fascinating under normal circumstances, but now it filled him with a cold dread that settled deep in his bones. For 3 weeks, he had been leading the Federation intelligence team tasked with investigating humanity's military capabilities, and what they had discovered was beyond anything the Council had imagined. The numbers alone were staggering. In the past century alone, humans had engaged in 2 global conflicts that killed over 100 million of their own species. The casualty figures from something called World War II were so massive that Kethmore had initially assumed there was an error in the translation algorithms. No civilized species could survive losing that many individuals and still function as a society, but the humans had not just survived. They had thrived. They had turned the systematic destruction of their enemies into an industrial process, developing weapons of such devastating power that they could eliminate entire cities in minutes. The research team had found documentation of something called nuclear weapons, devices capable of killing millions with a single detonation, and the humans had built thousands of them. Kethmore's assistant, junior analyst Vashtel, entered the office carrying another datapad filled with historical records. The young Villani looked exhausted and disturbed, as if the information he had been processing was giving him nightmares. "Sir," Vashtel said, his voice trembling slightly, "I have compiled the preliminary report on human conflict history. The scope is even worse than we initially calculated." "Show me," Kethmore said, though part of him wanted to stop this investigation before they learned something that would haunt the Federation forever. The holographic display shifted to show a timeline of human history stretching back thousands of years. Red markers indicated major conflicts, and Kethmore felt his blood chill as he realized that the red markers outnumbered the peaceful periods by an overwhelming margin. "They have been at war continuously," Vashtel explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just occasional conflicts like other species experienced before achieving civilization, but constant, systematic warfare. They have fought over territory, resources, ideology, religion, and sometimes just for the sake of fighting itself." The display zoomed in on specific conflicts, showing casualty estimates and tactical innovations. The humans had developed increasingly efficient methods of killing each other, from simple clubs and spears to weapons that could strike targets on the other side of their planet. They had studied warfare like other species studied art or philosophy, refining it into a precise science. "Look at this," Vashtel said, highlighting a section of the timeline. "Something they call the 100 Years' War, where 2 human nations fought for over a century. Or this period they call the Crusades, where they waged religious wars across multiple continents for 200 years. And here, their colonial periods, where they conquered and subjugated entire populations on every continent of their world." Kethmore studied the data with growing horror. The Federation had known war in the distant past, but nothing like this. Human warfare was not just about survival or resources. It was about domination, about imposing their will on others through overwhelming violence. They had turned killing into an art form. "What about their recent history?" Kethmore asked. "Surely they have achieved some measure of peace as they developed space travel?" Vashtel's expression grew even more troubled. "No, sir. If anything, their capacity for violence has increased. Even as they were taking their first steps into space, they were fighting wars in places called Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and dozens of other conflicts. They have not known true peace for a single generation in their entire recorded history." The implications were terrifying. The Federation had invited humanity to join their alliance based on the assumption that any species capable of space travel must have evolved beyond primitive warfare. Instead, they had welcomed a predator species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing. The office door chimed, and Kethmore looked up to see Colonel Steve Johnson entering with a small delegation of human military officers. The humans had requested this meeting to discuss expanding their training program, apparently unaware that the Federation was simultaneously investigating their species' capacity for violence. "Senior Analyst Kethmore," Colonel Johnson said with a smile that now seemed far more menacing than friendly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We have some exciting proposals for improving Federation military readiness." Kethmore gestured for the humans to take seats around the conference table, all the while acutely aware that these beings represented a species that had killed more of their own kind than any plague or natural disaster in Federation history. Understand there have been some concerns about Sergeant Rodriguez's training methods, Colonel Johnson continued. But given the success of his program, Earth Defense Command would like to establish permanent military academies on Federation worlds. We can provide instructors for advanced tactical training, strategic planning, and specialized warfare techniques. What kind of specialized techniques? Kethmore asked, though he suspected he did not want to know the answer. Major Kate Sullivan, a compact human female with scars on her hands that suggested personal combat experience, leaned forward with enthusiasm. Psychological warfare, urban combat operations, guerrilla tactics, asymmetric warfare strategies, and combined arms coordination. We can also provide training in intelligence gathering, sabotage operations, and what we call special forces techniques. Each term the humans mentioned sounded more ominous than the last. Kethmore had been studying human military doctrine for weeks, and he understood that these were not theoretical concepts but proven methods that had been tested in actual combat across multiple worlds and centuries. There's something you should? No, Kethmore said carefully. We have been researching human history, and we have discovered some concerning information about your species' approach to conflict resolution. The humans exchanged glances, and Kethmore caught something in their expressions that chilled him further. They were not surprised or offended by his statement. They looked like people who had been expecting this conversation. What exactly did you find? Colonel Johnson asked, his tone remaining friendly, but somehow more guarded. Kethmore activated the holographic display, showing the timeline of human conflicts. The humans studied the data with professional interest rather than shame, or embarrassment, as if they were reviewing a resume rather than evidence of their species' violent nature. Your people have been at war for their entire history, Kethmore said. The casualty figures from your conflicts exceed the total population of most Federation member worlds. You have developed weapons capable of destroying entire planets and military doctrines based on the systematic elimination of your enemies. That's all accurate, Colonel Johnson confirmed. Is there a problem with that information? The casual way the human acknowledged the data was perhaps more disturbing than the data itself. Kethmore realized that from the human perspective, their violent history was not something to be ashamed of, but simply a fact of their existence. We are concerned, Kethmore said slowly, that the Federation may have made an error in judgment by inviting humanity into our alliance. Your species represents a level of aggressive capability that we are not prepared to handle. Major Sullivan spoke up, her voice carrying a hint of steel that reminded Kethmore uncomfortably of Sergeant Rodriguez. With respect, Senior Analyst, you invited us here specifically because you needed military training. You can't ask us to teach you how to fight and then complain when you discover that we're good at it. The truth of her statement hit Kethmore like a physical blow. The Federation had indeed sought out human military expertise, but they had assumed that we're dealing with a species like themselves who had moved beyond warfare into more civilized forms of conflict resolution. Instead, they had invited wolves to train sheep, and now they were discovering that wolves were very good at being wolves. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Federation Border Patrol. Reports were coming in of multiple hegemony ships crossing into Federation space, ignoring all diplomatic protests and heading directly toward the outer colonies. Colonel Johnson listened to the reports with the calm attention of someone who had heard similar communications many times before. When the transmission ended, he looked around the table at the alien faces staring at him with growing desperation. Gentlemen, he said quietly, it sounds like your peaceful approach to the hegemony problem isn't working out. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative methods. The emergency session of the Federation Council convened at midnight, with representatives from 47 member worlds gathered in the Great Crystal Chamber on Kepler Prime. The news from the outer colonies was worse than anyone had anticipated. 3 worlds had gone silent after sending desperate pleas for help, and the hegemony fleet was advancing deeper into Federation space with each passing hour. Ambassador Zethkar stood at the center of the chamber, his pale blue skin looking almost gray under the harsh emergency lighting. Around him, the various alien species that made up the Federation Council argued in dozens of languages, their translators struggling to keep up with the rapid-fire debate. "The diplomatic channels have failed completely," announced Council Speaker Vorthak, a massive being whose species had not seen conflict in over 3 centuries. "The hegemony destroyed our negotiation vessel without even acknowledging our peace proposals. They are treating this as a war of conquest, not a political dispute." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the chamber. The very concept of war was so foreign to most Federation species that many council members seemed unable to process what they were hearing. They had built their entire civilization on the belief that violence was a relic of primitive times, and now they were facing an enemy that embraced it. "We must mobilize our defense forces," suggested Council Member Yethtel of the Andrean Republic. "Surely our superior technology and numbers will be sufficient to repel these invaders." "With what?" demanded General Kethmore, who had been hastily promoted after the Honor Guard's humiliating defeat by Rodriguez's cadets. "Our forces have no combat experience, no understanding of actual warfare, and no will to fight. The hegemony has been preparing for war while we have been preparing for parades." The harsh reality of their situation settled over the council like a blanket of despair. For generations, they had allowed their military capabilities to atrophy, believing that their peaceful nature would protect them from those who thought differently. Now they faced an enemy that understood only strength, and they had none to offer. "There is one option," Zethkar said quietly, his words cutting through the chaos of debate. "Emergency Protocol 7. The chamber fell silent. Emergency Protocol 7 had been written into Federation law centuries earlier, back when the memory of war was still fresh. It granted complete military authority to any individual or group deemed capable of defending Federation space in times of existential crisis. It had never been invoked because no such crisis had ever arisen. "You cannot be serious," protested Council Member Jextai. "Protocol 7 would give absolute power over all Federation forces to an outsider. The humans are not even full members of our alliance." "The humans are the only ones who understand warfare," Zethkar replied. "We invited them here to teach us military tactics, and they have proven their effectiveness beyond question. If we want to survive this crisis, we must accept that our peaceful methods are insufficient against an enemy that respects only violence." The debate that followed was unlike anything in Federation history. For the first time in centuries, the Council was forced to confront the possibility that their civilization might not survive its encounter with a more aggressive species. Some members argued that it was better to maintain their principles and face destruction than to compromise their values by embracing violence. Others insisted that survival was the highest moral imperative. The vote was close, passing by a margin of only 3 votes. 25 worlds supported invoking Emergency Protocol 7, 22 opposed it, and 7 abstained rather than choose between their principles and their survival. It was enough to activate the protocol and grant Rodriguez complete authority over all Federation military forces. Rodriguez received the news while standing in the command center of the newly constructed human training facility on Kepler Prime. Major Kate Sullivan and Captain Ben Parker flanked him as he read the official authorization, granting him the temporary rank of Federation Combat Marshal and unlimited resources to defend Federation space. "Well," Ben said with dark humor, "you wanted to teach them about warfare. It looks like you're going to get the chance to give them a practical demonstration." Rodriguez looked out through the facility's windows at the Federation fleet assembling in orbit above the planet. Ships that had been designed for exploration and ceremony were being hastily retrofitted with weapon systems, while their crews struggled to understand concepts that human children learned from history books. "How long do we have?" Rodriguez asked. "Intelligence estimates the hegemony will reach New Geneva in 72 hours, Kate replied. "It's a major industrial world with over 2 billion civilians. If it falls, the psychological impact alone could cause half the Federation to surrender." Rodriguez nodded grimly. New Geneva would be the test case for everything he had been trying to teach the Federation about the reality of warfare. The hegemony expected to face the same ceremonial forces that had been so easily defeated in previous skirmishes. Instead, they would encounter Federation troops. Trained in human military doctrine, the preparation was unlike anything the Federation had ever attempted. Rodriguez's human instructors spread throughout the fleet, teaching crash courses in tactics that had been refined through centuries of human conflict. Federation officers learned about acceptable casualties, strategic deception, total war concepts, and the brutal mathematics of combat effectiveness. Many alien crews struggled with these concepts. The idea of deliberately sacrificing one ship to save 3 others was alien to beings who had been taught that every life was precious and that violence was never the answer. But necessity drove adaptation, and those who could not adapt were replaced by those who could. The battle for new Geneva began when the hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace expecting to find a lightly defended industrial world. Instead, they encountered a Federation force that had been positioned using human tactical doctrine, with layered defenses, kill zones, and carefully planned fields of fire. Rodriguez commanded the engagement from the Federation flagship, applying lessons learned from human naval warfare to a 3-dimensional space battle. His forces did not meet the hegemony head-on in the traditional Federation manner. Instead, they used the system's asteroid belt for cover, employed feints and deceptions to mask their true strength, and coordinated attacks designed to cripple enemy ships rather than simply exchange fire. The hegemony fleet had been expecting another easy victory against ceremonial forces. They found themselves fighting an enemy that used tactics they had never encountered, commanded by beings who understood that war was not about honor or glory, but about winning at any cost. The battle lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the hegemony invasion fleet. Not a single enemy ship escaped to report back to their superiors. The Federation had achieved a victory so overwhelming that it would be weeks before the hegemony leadership even understood what had happened to their forces. Rodriguez stood in his command center looking at the tactical displays showing the debris field that had once been the hegemony fleet. Around him, Federation officers who had never fired a shot in anger just hours earlier now stared at the screens with expressions he recognized from human veterans, the mixture of triumph, exhaustion, and horror that came with surviving there. First real battle. "Sir," Captain Vextai reported, the Krillion's voice carrying a new edge that had not been there before the battle. "All enemy vessels destroyed. Our casualties are minimal. The civilian population of New Geneva is secure." Rodriguez nodded, feeling the weight of what they had accomplished and what it meant for the future. The Federation had saved itself, but in doing so, it had fundamentally changed what it meant to be a member of the galactic community. They had learned the human lesson, that sometimes peace could only be maintained through the credible threat of overwhelming violence. The communication came in from Earth 3 days later. Rodriguez found himself promoted to permanent Federation combat marshal, with authorization to establish human military training academies on every member world. The galaxy had learned that humans were not just another species to be welcomed into the community of civilized worlds. They were the reminder that civilization itself sometimes required the capacity for controlled savagery. Rodriguez looked out at the expanding network of training facilities and the streams of alien cadets arriving to learn human military doctrine. The Federation was safe, but they would never again be innocent. They had discovered that the universe was not as peaceful as they had believed, and that survival sometimes demanded embracing the very violence they had spent centuries trying to forget. The galaxy was changing, and humanity had found its place in it not as diplomats or scientists, but as the species others called when they needed to remember how to fight.